request Dr. Jay Bansal to introduce the theme for the conference.
Distinguished speakers and panelists, honored guests, members of the news media, and dear participants in the audience. Namaskar, Sat Sri Akal, and a very good morning to you all. I'm deeply honored to be here standing in the presence of such distinguished intellectuals. On behalf of the entire organizing team, I would like to thank all of you for taking time to be part of this important conversation on a phenomenon that we're calling Hindudvesha. Many people call it Hinduphobia, but I believe that is a misnomer. You see, phobia means fear. And frankly, no one is afraid of Hindus, and there is really no reason why anyone should. Dvesha, on the other hand, means hate, aversion, and hostility. Those are the sentiments which more accurately describe the experiences that we are having in modern times. So, where does Hindu Dvesh come from? How does it get propagated? And more importantly, how does it impact the Hindu ecosystem? Those are, of course, the questions that our eminent panelists and speakers will be discussing during the rest of the day. What I like to do in the next 15 minutes or so is to draw your attention to some of the pivotal events which have taken place over time as we trace the arc of history over the last 1,000 to 1,200 years. As I was preparing for this event, there was one question that was hovering on my mind. What language should I choose to address you this morning? And of course, I ended up settling on English as the language of choice. A language that was foisted upon us roughly 200 years ago by a cruel act of colonial hubris. It's like a dead body that we have been carrying for almost all our lives, to a point where it has become an integral part of our DNA. It has alienated us from our way of thinking, the way of talking, the way of relating to each other, how we greet each other, our food habits, and how we dress. Indeed, it has turned us into what I call coconuts, brown on the outside, but white on the inside. That, of course, is the language that we're going to use today, but let's keep in mind that this was a monumental act of Hindu Dvesha with far-reaching consequences. Now I will take you roughly 1,200 years back, when the Islamic invaders first came knocking on our door. What happened over the next 1,000 years or so is known to us all. Massacre, pillage, rape, forced conversions, temple destructions, burning of centers of knowledge, dislocation of large tracts of population. This is all recorded in its gory details by their own historians. I think we can safely call it as an extended act of Hindu Dvesha over a long period of time. Next came European colonizers, starting in the late 15th century. While the Islamic era can be safely characterized as genocidal, the European era was nothing short of ethnocidal. The Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, and finally the British. They all took their turns at robbing us of everything that they could take. Not only did they cart away our material wealth. They also robbed us of our way of life, our civilizational history, and indeed our very identity. I will attempt to bring out some of the pivotal events from this era, especially from the British period. In 1776, William Jones translated Manusmriti into English, declaring Manu as the Hindu lawgiver, like Moses in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Despite the fact that it is highly doubtful if Manusmriti was ever a universal law in any part of this nation, a country, at any time, and the fact that there are more than 50 different versions of Manusmriti floating around, Jones's translation has become the West's worldview of what Hindu society is all about. And they continue to, based on that, they continue to call us hierarchical and oppressive. Towards the end of the 18th century, Oriental studies, which were later called Indic studies or Indology, became popular field of study in the humanities. Sanskrit texts were being furiously studied and translated into various European languages. It is not difficult to imagine that their translations or their analysis of our texts will be done through the Judeo-Christian framework. It was really a case of European academics interpreting our scriptures and then turning around and telling us what our traditions really meant. Unfortunately, as the West was studying us like laboratory animals, many of us were celebrating the fact that someone was interested in our scriptures. Professor Arvind Sharma, a Hindu scholar at McGill University, has made a pithy statement, and I quote, "For such an oxymoron as Western Indology to exist, someone had to be the moron." Guess what? We filled that role very well. Worse was to come. In the early 19th century, German people were searching for a national identity. Meanwhile, the German Indologists were analyzing our Sanskrit scripts, Sanskrit texts, and they came to the conclusion that Mahabharata actually was their ancestral history. They imagined the existence of a master race, which they called Aryans, with origin somewhere in Eastern Europe, of course. They were white, Sanskrit was their language, and they were the ones who wrote Vedas and our other scriptures. According to them, the Western branch went to Europe, particularly to Germany, and they were pure in blood, whereas the Eastern branch came to India and got mixed in with the tribals here and got degenerated. This act of laying claim to our civilizational history is a classical example of appropriation of our intellectual assets by the Europeans. Unfortunately, this was not last such act. Around 1850, Max Müller, a German Indologist in the employ of East India Company, gave a further twist to the Aryan race theory. He said Aryans actually who came to India, they were invaders. They came and invaded and pushed the Dravidians from the north to the south. What did that do? In one fell swoop, it removed our exclusive claim to our ancestral lands, and it created a huge societal divide between the so-called Aryans and Dravidians, the effects of which we continue to feel to this very day. Now, for the next two acts, and I'm mindful of the time, but for the next two acts, I will make give you two statements from the mid-1800s. The first one comes from a Christian Missionary Conference of 1850, which states, "Caste is one of the greatest obstacles to the progress of the gospel in India." They, of course, were talking about the Varna Jati system. The second statement comes from Karl Marx, the philosophical grandfather of today's leftist cabal. He states that England had to fulfill a double mission in India: the annihilation of the old Asiatic society and laying a material foundation of Western society in India. Now, what is common to these two statements? Very simply, that the Western view of Indian social structure was that it was a problem that had to be solved. And if not solved, it had to be destroyed. So, now to the two events that I want to refer to. In 1871, Herbert Risley, a confirmed racist and director of the British Ethnography and Census, decided to reorganize us on the lines of European caste system. He created a vertical taxonomy of castes and forced the Indian population to fit into this taxonomy. This structure was first used in 1901 census, and the problems were starting to become obvious to the British bureaucrats right from the start. They had to keep reinventing new castes in order to fit the very complex social structure that we are and that we were. So much so that by 1931, they actually abandoned the effort. Therefore, it is a great shame that the founders of Free India's Constitution decided to take caste on board into our Constitution. If their intent was to de-emphasize and delegitimize this monstrosity, it was a funny way of doing it. Today, the very system that was forced on our society by the British is being weaponized against us to demonize the Hindu society. The second event, which a lot of people don't know about, is the passage of something called the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871. This act criminalized entire communities by designating them as habitual criminals. All the males were forced to report weekly to the police, and their movements were severely restricted. At the time of India's independence in 1947, there were some 13 million people in 137 communities who were subject to search and seizure if they were found outside of their restricted areas. So if someone is looking for the root cause of the Dalit problem, they need not look any further than the Criminal Tribes Act of 1971. Today, there are Dalit groups all over the world who have joined hands with the leftists, Christian missionaries, and other anti-Hindu forces. They lose no opportunity to blame the Varna Jati system for the social stratification that we see in our society today, conveniently giving a free pass to the misdeeds of the colonial powers. The events that I have described may seem distant in time. However, they are the very foundations upon which the current Hindudvesha narrative is built and is being propagated. Whether it is Wendy Doniger's interpreting our Itihasa through the Freudian lens, or Sheldon Pollock claiming that Sanskrit is the root cause of Nazi Holocaust, or the leftist cabal distorting our civilizational narrative, they're all working from the schema that was formulated during the colonial era. Finally, to the reason why we're here and why we're having this conversation. I'll quote George Orwell, who said, "The most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history." The reverse, I hope, is also true. In order to rebuild a society deeply entrenched in the colonial narrative, I believe we have to find a way to recover and to rebuild our true narrative. To that end, I urge and invite the academics, our intellectuals, to dig deep and find the will, the time, and the energy to work on recovering and rebuilding our history and countering the false narrative that is parading around as our civilizational history. With those, I thank you for your patience. Namaste.